Details of the meeting of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee. Section 2. This 1.3 trillion is not a very sufficient amount of money, okay? This is the first incremental amount of money. That is, increasing the deficit GDP ratio, even if it is increased by 1, can provide an increase of 1.3 trillion yuan. The second part is the ultra-long-term special treasury bonds, which are not included in the deficit. In 2024, the amount of ultra-long-term special treasury bonds issued is $1 trillion. And what is that $1 trillion money for? The $1 trillion XE does two things. It's called a two-star program and a two-star program, which is a trade-in of this consumer product, and this new equipment is still new, and the double. Oh, I'm not gonna say it for a second so I can say his old word. The two is fencing. To put it bluntly, it is infrastructure. How will the $1 trillion here this year be distributed? It's 322 billion stars and 70 billion, that's the majority of it. Or the three pieces on top of the fencing one is 2 stars, but 2 stars weigh 2. And there's a reason for that, because 2 stars is a trade-in subsidy. It has a leverage effect to pull social investment, right? For example, if I am in this new energy vehicle, the state will give you a subsidy of 10,000 yuan, but what you have to pay 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 to buy a new car. So this 10,000 yuan is able to drive for 5,500 or more of this money investment. Therefore, the 2 stars of 300 billion can actually pull the consumption funds of more than 300 billion but 700 billion. That's basically infrastructure. 700,000 is 700 billion and 700 billion is the corresponding number, like say 750 billion, right? Infrastructure corresponds to the total fixed asset investment of the country. And the total fixed asset investment of the country in 2023 is about 51 trillion yuan. On this basis, the 700 billion yuan is really not much, and the 700 billion yuan corresponds to 510 billion yuan. If the national total fixed asset investment still declines, 700 billion yuan may be more difficult to arrest this decline. Therefore, in addition to the supersite, special debt, there is also a part of the special debt. What about special debt? In 2024, the amount of new special bonds of local governments is 3.9 trillion. This number is likely to be available next year. And it is likely to increase to 4.5 trillion, but 4.5 trillion also has a small problem. Previously, we have mentioned that in order to draw debt, 800 billion special debt will be increased every year with the scale of painting debt. This 800 billion will very well go into the government to pay salaries and solve some triangle debt problems, but 4.5 trillion minus 800 billion, but in fact, the amount of extra money earmarked for other areas is 3.7 trillion. Compared with 3.9 million this year, there is actually no big difference, so from the total point of view, I think this is a reason for the market's dissatisfaction. Even with the deficit to GDP ratio, a 1% increase would add $1.3 trillion. What about this money? Betting on all kinds of bald cages is not enough. The super long-term special treasury bond is $1 trillion this year, and even if it doubles to $2 trillion next year, it's possible. But it's probably going to be less than double that. Let's go with the high line. Next year, the 2 trillion is 1.4 trillion and 600 billion of the 2 hearts. I will calculate for him what economic increment can be brought to special 39,000 in order to 4.5 trillion. In fact, the overall quality is not as expected by the market, not as good as the market's expectations of so-called accommodative and proactive fiscal policy. And now that we have finished this part, what is this door about? That is, the increment of the Economic Work Conference this year is the 3 parts, that is, the increase in the deficit and the super long-term special national debt. And special debt, these 3 parts, then these 3 parts of the money specifically used for what? What effect can be done? In this year's document, there's a reference to something called. I have to say that this is a really useful area. For example, if you want to boost domestic demand, the most direct way to really solve the structural problem is to increase income. In the past, it has always been about promoting the income of the middle and low income groups, and this time it is the first time to mention reducing the burden, which is a new formula. But I think reducing the burden is also the key. How to reduce the burden on the middle and low income groups? There are 2 points. The first, personal income tax. The second, increase in welfare. Mainly these 2 points. In this case, we also mentioned the increase of welfare, but did not raise personal income tax reduction. But personal income tax reduction may be the most direct. We also included it. In this part, if the country really wants to find ways to increase the income of low and middle income groups and reduce the burden, this is what everyone can really enjoy. How much is this penny? Basically, the money would come from adding $1.3 trillion to the deficit. We say that these 1.3 things to do well, the 3 guarantees project, and so on and so on. Let's see if we get all 1.3 bits. To increase income and reduce the burden on low and middle income groups. Is this money enough to reduce the burden, and how to subtract? I just mentioned 2 things. One is personal income tax. One is the welfare system for urban and rural residents. Let's start with the individual tax. The individual tax system to reduce the burden of individual tax revenue in the national fiscal revenue of 14,700 yuan is not particularly large. At present, the threshold of 5,000 is said to be increased by 8,000, which is increased by 1,000. Even if the threshold is raised by 11,000 million, individual income tax will be exempted. I think this is the right thing to do, and if so, how much would the tax cut be? What is the margin of profit for society? If this is done, the amount of benefits to society now calculated at 308 billion yuan is about this amount. So if the state can do this part, it is really a good thing. I wish he could do it, but this part 3081, after, how much of the deficit is left? We still have 900 billion left over, right? Okay, 900 billion. Let's see if 900 billion is sweet enough. Welfare whole. First of all, as we all know, China has 2 welfare systems, one for urban and rural residents and the other for urban workers. Urban workers are the big part of the whole. That is, our dual-track welfare system is still not solved, although urban and rural areas have leveled off, but urban and rural. Because the city is mainly workers, so urban residents mainly enjoy workers. What about these 2 things? The difference can be said to be heaven and earth. Let's start with the medical insurance for urban and rural residents. 960 million people are covered by medical insurance for urban and rural residents, and 370 million people are covered by medical insurance for employees, the so-called limited employee health insurance. The number of people insured is much smaller than the resident health insurance, but in the case of 960 million residents, the expenditure is only $1 trillion in the case of employee health insurance compared to 3.7 trillion. 370 million people, the expenditure is 2.8 trillion, so the average expenditure is much higher. That 960 million people participated in medical insurance for residents, covering 2.6 billion people. And 370 million people participated in medical insurance for employees. The number of people who enjoy it is 2.5 billion. The number of people is similar, but the number of people who participate in it is much lower, so I gave him me. I helped him build the calculation. You don't have to do it yourself. I'll do it for you. The average expenditure on resident medical insurance is 2.7. The average expenditure on employee health insurance is 6.8 people, which is much higher. And the average expenditure gap is even larger. The average expenditure on medical insurance for residents was 398 yuan, and the average expenditure on medical insurance for employees was 1,106 yuan.